So with that in mind, those seven key features that help to define what culture is, we're still left with this question of what is culture? Culture is best defined as the collective processes through which people construct and naturalize certain meanings and actions as normal and even necessary. So this is more precise than simply talking about core values, beliefs, etc. And emphasizes that culture is not a static set of rules, or a totally coherent system of symbolic beliefs that people have or carry like a toolbox that gets passed down from generation to generation. This allows for instead the dynamic, ever-changing kind of features of culture. It also proposes that culture is something that is emergent, that is constantly being formed and reformed, that it can even be unstable as it responds to innovation, creativity, and struggles over meaning. So here's our first think critically about culture, and we're not going to stop the lecture here. We're going to just take a moment. You pause the lecture while you think about this. How can understanding uh, the complexities of culture help us make sense of the day-to-day world in which we live? Think about all of the things that qualify as culture. Think about all the things that are ever changing, and then really specifically think about an example from your life that helps to illustrate those answers. I mean, for me, it's this definition of how we conduct education, right? That we are constantly in flux right now in response to the coronavirus, and we never know really whether it's going to. I mean, we have no idea when it's going to end. How online instruction differs from face-to-face instruction, et cetera. We're having to redefine the paradigm and reevaluate how we do things. And some things that work really well in concrete classrooms don't work as well online. So culture is ever changing, but at the same time, it feels relatively stable. So we've got to ask ourselves why. Societies function most smoothly when the cultural processes feel natural and stable. The stabilization occurs via collective symbols, through values, through cultural norms that are reinforced, and through traditions. So we'll talk about each of these in turn. Symbols, one of the most important thing about symbols is that they are arbitrary. Therefore, they can mean something different to different populations. So here we have an image that designates a rural Scandinavian outhouse, and it has a heart on it, right? We don't tend to think of hearts as being associated with outhouses, if anything, and we don't necessarily all have a vast amount of experience with outhouses. We might think of the crescent moon, for example. That's what stereotypically I always saw in iconography as we were watching movies with outhouses, etc. But this heart means something different to different cultures. So when we think about our use of symbols, I mean, even something as simple as the alphabet, right? The alphabet, the kind of Indo-European alphabet that we use is functionally very, very different from the kanji systems of Asia. And so something as simple as the sounds that are present in our language and the way that we iconographically reflect or depict those sounds can be vastly different. So symbols do change, sometimes dramatically, but nevertheless, symbols tend to remain particularly stable. They're also easily remembered and they preserve a culture's conventional meaning. So when you think about symbols of the United States, right, what do you think of? You think of the flag. Our flag has changed historically, uh, most notably in the number of stars that it has on it, with one star representing each state. If we ever voted to, let's say, have Puerto Rico join as a full state instead of just a territory, right, we'd have to redesign our flag. But there are fundamental things about our flag that have stayed consistent since really 1776, right, since the inception of America as a country. Our flag is easily remembered, right? As students, we say the pledge, we stand for the national anthem, etc., and for the values kind of that symbol upholds. Values tend to conserve a society's dominant ideas about morality and social issues. Values can change. They typically do so more slowly than other aspects of culture. So when we think about American values, right, we've got the flag and we've got apple pie here. We could also throw in a picture of baseball, right? We could have a house with a white picket fence and a dog outside and a cat in the window. We have these things that are pervasively American. And these include things like democracy, freedom, individuality. When we think about those freedoms, we expect to have freedom of speech, we expect to have freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, etc. One thing that has come to light in our global response to the pandemic is that many of these freedoms are paused or put on hold during times of the outbreak, because it's not safe to assemble, because it's not safe to uh, hold our large religious institutions and our religious practices. So these values can change. However, they change rather slowly. Norms, cultural norms. These typically remain stable because people learn them from an early age and because society encourages conformity, right? So think about some of the norms that you engage in when you're walking down the sidewalk or you're walking up or down a set of stairs. Which side do you stand on? Generally, we all stand on the right. When you drive on a road, which side do you drive on? You drive on the right, right? These are cultural norms. There's nothing inherently better about standing on the right versus standing on the left, or driving on the right versus driving on the left. Obviously, we're not going to want to drive on the left, because when everybody else is driving on the right, that's a surefire way to an accident. But there are countries in the world, cultures in the world, where instead of being gravitating towards the right side, you gravitate towards the left side. Think about styles of dress, right? We don't often find people in for example, ethnic indigenous dress. I mean, when you go to school, you're not going to see necessarily the vast variety of cultural expressions and style of dress. That's something that's particularly reinforced in middle school, right? Conformity is kind of supreme in that middle school context. Norms usually go unnoticed by people until they've been violated, and that violation can be kind of reinforced in a negative way. So when you think about middle school, for example, when we've really got this utmost desire to fit in, that the way that those norms are culturally reinforced is through kind of social ostracism and such. And so, you violate something, you dress the wrong way, you wear the wrong thing, you speak the wrong way, etc. You end up losing your friends. And is this right? Is this, appropriate? No, probably not. But it does particularly feel inevitable in a context like middle school. So what are some of our norms in the US or New Mexico besides walking on the right, driving on the right? We could think about, um, you know, holiday light displays, right? Or even simply whether we refer to the paper bags with sand and candles in them as luminarias or farolitos, right? That's going to depend on whether you come from northern New Mexico or southern New Mexico, and there's a different story associated with both terms. When you come from northern New Mexico, the luminaria is a larger kind of bonfire. The farolito are the little bags. Think about comfort foods and what's socially acceptable to eat. If you went to I don't know, some large like common area and pulled out a salad that was covered in crickets, for example, I mean, that's going to get you funny looks from a lot of people. So we've got these norms that are pretty consistently stable and really focus on conformity. Now, conformity is not always ideal, right? We should be free to express ourselves in whatever way that we see fit, but the reality is that there are many times in our lives where we're driven to conform. Then we think about traditions. These are usually assumed to be timeless, or at least very old, right? When we hear the start of the Pledge of Allegiance, many of us are able to recite that alongside. When we hear the start of the Star Spangled Banner, right, then we stand up and either place our hand over our heart, or take our hat off and place our hat over our heart, right? We've got these traditions that are supposed to represent a cultural value that is patriotism, right? Think about some of your other traditions. these are things like liturgical orders, right? When we talk about Roman Catholicism and we talk about the responses and such, I mean, these are long-standing. I remember um, when it switched from "I give you my peace be with you," and it switched from "and also with you" to "and with your spirit," right? So when we see a change in liturgical orders, I mean, that takes a while to get used to. And you still have older members of the Catholic Church who still say, um, and with you, and also with you, instead of "and with your spirit." So we think about those traditions. Think about traditions in your families, right? Holidays are a time where we often cling to traditions, and it's been interesting for me to watch as new traditions emerge in our families. Things that my husband and I decided to do differently once we had kids, and how that has carried over in our kids. It's the only thing they've known, and if we don't engage in those particular traditions around holiday times, they get upset. So, I mean, traditions are not necessarily unchangeable, but it's hard to get past that notion of things have always been a certain way. So, when we think about something like the civil rights movement and desegregation in the South, right? One of the big factors was fighting against tradition, fighting against this notion that things have always been a certain way. And it's one reason as well that trying to change the culture of an 80-year-old man is harder than changing the culture of a 5-year-old, right? That notion of things have always been a certain way make us in our old age unlikely to accept things being a different way. So here's our second thinking critically. Students think it's easy to identify symbols, values, norms, and tradition that support other people's practices. But it's harder to think about your own daily practices in the same way. And so here, while you think and reflect, I want you to use any of your own daily practices to illustrate these four features of how these four features of culture reinforce your own behavior, right? So think about those values, think about the symbols, think about the norms, and think about the traditions, right? It can be something as simple as, what do you do before breakfast every day, right? You might think breakfast is important, or you may think that skipping breakfast is no big deal, right? You might say grace before breakfast. You might not. You might have certain foods that symbolize breakfast to you. I mean, it's hard to think of pancakes as a food that's not a breakfast food, right? And we tend to think of it as weird when people have something like, I don't know, chicken noodle soup for breakfast, because that's not a quote unquote breakfast food. So you can think about some relatively benign aspect of your daily life and then really challenge yourself to think about how these four interrelated features, the symbols, the values, the norms, and the traditions, factor into reinforcing that cultural practice. All right, so social institutions also express culture. This is one reason why culture feels so stable, because social institutions reinforce it. And so they do so through prevalent economic activities, through the patterns of kinship and marriage, through political typology or political structure, and through religious institutions. So when we think about aspects of life in New Mexico, for example, we've already talked about the fact that Roman Catholicism is very tightly tied to a lot of people's cultural identity in New Mexico. And so it shouldn't be surprised that we have an overwhelming support of things like farolitos or luminarias at Christmas, right? Because Christmas is a Christian holiday, and Catholicism is a branch of Christianity. So we see the greater society as a whole. I mean, what does the mall do around Christmas time, right? They put out decorations, they have Santa ready for kids. This serves to reinforce the notion that we're a Christian area of the United States, or that the United States is a Christian nation, right? How many times have we heard this debated in the political realm as to whether the United States is a Christian nation. Our nation was founded on the freedom of religion, and basically stated that no one religion would become official or nationally sanctioned religion. Yet, when we swear in new Congress members, we have them place their hand on the Bible. Right? We don't offer the choice of the Bible, the Quran, the Torah, etc. So it's very challenging to be a non-Christian in a country that so many of the social institutions support Christianity. I've got friends who came out of the Jewish Orthodoxy, for example, and anti-Semitism is gaining a foothold right now in mainstream America. There have been attacks on synagogues. There have been hate crimes, swastikas painted at high schools, etc., all of which reflect this notion of people of the Jewish faith as being different, nefarious, or whatever the reason is, right? Something justifying their hate for someone who practices a different cultural practice. So when society serves to reinforce the norm, whether that's favoritism for whites over blacks through racial profiling of police stops and stuff, whether that's favoritism of Christianity over Judaism or Islam, we end up with a stable culture that seems very, very reticent to accept different cultural beliefs and practices. All right, so one school of thought as to what culture serves to do and how society kind of reinforces culture is the anthropological theory of functionalism. This has been associated most closely with Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, two British anthropologists. It proposes that cultural beliefs and practices perform particular functions for societies, and that these cultural beliefs and practices explain how the world works and organizes people into efficient roles. It emphasizes that these social institutions function together in an integrated and balanced fashion to keep the whole society functioning smoothly and to minimize social change. So basically, culture serves to facilitate conformity and stability, and that the way that culture is integrated with the entire society, the way that these institutions are structured, serve to promote that conformity and stability. Um, Functionalism is not, I mean, this is not, I wouldn't go so high as to say that this is like universally accepted, right? It's not. There are critics of functionalism that argue that it was too associated with what we called natural sciences, and that functionalism viewed culture as too stable and smoothly functioning. So, what do we mean by this, and how would we say that functionalism is associated or allied with natural sciences? Well, one of the things is that culture, that we all have innate biological urges, and that culture serves to kind of structure appropriate methods of coping with those biological urges. So, an example would be we all have the biological urge to mate, right? We don't, that doesn't imply that we all have the same definition of sexuality and sexual identity, and that we all have the same definition of what makes it culturally, when is it culturally appropriate to mate and not to mate, but that there are certain functions of society to reinforce and come up with socially acceptable ways in which that biological urge can be fulfilled. So one of those is through the association of mating with marriage, right? And then we can look at the cultural institutions that promote or enable certain marital patterns above others. So, for example, in the United States, partly because of this close association with Christianity and the idea that marriage is supposed to be one man, one woman, right? We outlaw polygamy. Polygamy means multiple partners. It doesn't specify which sex. We can break polygamy down into polygyny, which means one male, multiple females, or polyandry, which means one female, multiple males, right? We tend to not accept polygamy as a marital pattern, but we also had years where we didn't accept same sex marriages as valid. So, the function here recognizes the role that marriage patterns play in promoting kind of the conservation of the species um, and really legitimizing alliances that serve to procreate, right? One other feature of anthropology as a whole, and something that functionalism, even in spite of its shortcomings, has given us as a legacy, is that anthropology is holistic, that we approach studying humanity from a perspective of holism. This is a methodological tool that helps to show the interrelationships among different domains of a society, rather than necessarily suggesting that different parts are wholly integrated and balanced. And so we recognize that different domains of societies, different domains kind of assert themselves and influence other domains. And so as we talk about ways of making a living and how that influences other aspects of society, interestingly, one of the biggest predictors of whether culture is going to appear similar in two societies, there's kind of two ways that that occurs. One of that is through what we call cultural phylogeny, that those cultures have their same root or origin. So why are American traditions very much like British traditions? Well, because America was a British colony. Why in New Mexico do we do things that are similar to Mexico and Spain? Well, because many of the colonial members in these areas were descended from Spanish conquistadors. So, kind of the role that colonialism and then expansion and warfare and such played. So, um, cultural phylogeny is a big reason why cultures are similar, but the second biggest reason is that they produce their resources in the same way. So when we talk about making a living, we'll talk about something called adaptive strategies. Those deal with the system of economic production and redistribution. And we'll talk about five main adaptive strategies: foraging, horticulture, pastoralism, agriculture, and industrialism. We could argue that there's a sixth with post industrialism. We'll talk about that a little bit later in the term. But we find that by and large, the system of producing resources and distributing resources has a big impact on other things like group size, like political structure, like religion, like marriage patterns, like residence patterns, etc. And so holism allows us to see how each of these subsets, each of these small parts of a culture influence one another, and that sometimes those can be at odds with one another. So, for example, just think about industrialized nations or even post industrial nations. Think about large Western populations, right? We value democracy and individuality and capitalism at all costs. Other countries, like let's say Denmark, value kind of social welfare and kind of a socialist democracy that supports helping those in our society who need things. Both can be incredibly successful, right? But we have to recognize that in modern America, at least, capitalism is not wholly balanced with like socially, ethically equity, really. And so, in a lot of ways, letting capitalism rise to the forefront has occurred at a detriment to a large part of the population. We're seeing an ever increasing divide between the people who control the resources and have access to large amounts of resources and those who don't. We've seen a vanishing middle class. We've essentially seen ourselves transition from a democratic republic to an oligarchy where wealth kind of rules all. So, we've got to recognize that even though there is integration at the societal level, that these things are integrated with one another and influence one another, they're also not always balanced and like happy go lucky, right? That there can be conflict between different aspects of culture. All right, so to think about this critically, anthropologists feel that holism is one of the key aspects of culture because it links together lots of things that people in other disciplines do not routinely think about. So take an object in daily life to show how it's holistically linked to other aspects. So, for example, think about an item that you use in your classes: a book, a pencil and paper, an iPad, a laptop. How is that object linked to, or how does that object break from our past? How can it be linked to other aspects of our lives, right? Let's take your phone, for example, right? Many of you use your phone not only for social purposes, but um, also for school purposes, right? Have you ever taken notes on your phone? Accessed um, have you ever accessed class resources on your phone when you've been out? Do you access your email when you're out, right? Our phones can fill as something that helps us with work, as something that helps us with school, as something that also keeps us socially integrated and connected to people that we feel are important to us. Our phone, though, can also serve as our calendar, right? Can also serve as an alarm clock. Our phone can serve as a way to listen to music, as a way to watch movies, as a way to waste a considerable amount of time playing something like Candy Crush, right? Um, our phones can also kind of suck us in and lead to addiction problems. Our phones can reset our biological clocks. They affect particularly the blue wavelengths of light affect our circadian rhythm, for example. So, we are so super connected to our cell phones. But yet, I remember, I think it was 1996 was when my husband and I got our very first cell phone. Prior to that point, when we were out, there was no way for people to get in touch with you. And then in the early 90s, we had pagers. And so he had one for work that I would also use if I needed to get in touch with them. But I mean, people left you messages at home. You didn't feel like you were missing a vital part of your life if you didn't carry a phone with you when you went out in public. In 1996, our first cell phone was like briefcase sized and had a really crappy battery life and also was really expensive. Like every call on it was really expensive. It couldn't text, it couldn't do any other things. So in just like 30 years, we've reached a point where we feel lost without our phones. It was supposed to make things easier. It was supposed to make our lives simpler, having everything available in one location. And instead, right, we define our very meaning and existence oftentimes on the basis of the phone. So, think about something like that. Take something that's an object that you use every day and figure out how that functions across the whole of your life experiences. All right, so our last point for this lecture is going to talk about, can anybody own culture? No, we recognize from a philosophical standpoint that nobody can own the collective processes that make the artificial seem natural, but we do see conflicts that arise as people have different claims to the exclusive right of symbols that give culture power and meaning. And so this brings up the idea of cultural appropriation, right? Um, can people from one culture own something like a dance, like the samba from Brazil, or the tango from Argentina, that originated with people from another ethnic group? Um, can anyone own a particular style of pop music, right? Like K-pop, something like that. Um, we think about all the things that we have trademarked and copyrighted and patented and such in a modern context. People own the rights to medication. People own the rights to certain words and phrases. People own the rights to trademarked symbols. So you couldn't open a coffee shop and have a mermaid as a symbol and call it like Star Dollar, right? Because you would be co-opting trademarked icon symbols of a company like Starbucks. So how does this then relate to what we call cultural appropriation? And what we'll talk about later is indigenous intellectual property rights. So what do I mean by this? Well, think about the Zia symbol, right? The Zia symbol is a symbol of the state of New Mexico, right? We see the Zia symbol on our state flag. We see stylized representations of the Zia symbol out of different substances, like, the donut at the center of the Zia symbol, etc. Yet the Zia symbol essentially belongs to Zia Pueblo, right, belongs to a particular Native American group and has religious significance for it. There are petroglyphs, out even at the Petroglyph Park here in Albuquerque, right, that use that Zia symbol. It is intimately associated with people from Zia, and we as a state have co-opted it. Now, maybe that's okay because we have people throughout the state who are Puebloan, right? But really, essentially, that is cultural appropriation. Now, if we take it a step farther and we had a company that wanted to incorporate the Zia symbol into their logo, right? Is that okay? Or is that cultural appropriation? As we see a tendency towards tribal, quote unquote, tribal fashion, right? Should just white people in like New Jersey get Zia symbol tattoos, or is that cultural appropriation? Now, with respect to this indigenous intellectual property rights, I'm just going to give you an example real quick, and then our lecture will conclude. But there is a group in the Brazilian Amazon called the Ata, and they have recently, as in like the past 5 years, finished a large encyclopedia, about 500 pages, of all of their ethnobotany and indigenous medicine. Okay, so this is one of the reasons that they did this was because fewer of their young were pursuing shamanistic healing arts as like a profession or a life way. So they needed a way to condense all of their ethnomedicine into one source so that if there weren't apprenticeship types of opportunities for future healers, that they would have a reference book to go back to that encompassed the entire body of their ethnomedicinal knowledge. Well, there's been a push by the government, by outside sources, for them to translate this encyclopedia into both Spanish and or English. And the Ata don't want to. Can you guess why? Because what's going to happen is the moment they translate that into a language that's more widely accessible to others, particularly Spanish or English, pharmaceutical companies are going to get a hold of that. They could be sitting on the cure to cancer. Do they have an ethical obligation and owe us, as the greater international society as a whole, that knowledge to cure cancer? Right? The moment that they open themselves up to corporate pharmaceutical kind of exploitation, they're going to lose land rights to their traditional territory. They're going to lose the right to continue to live as a society as they have for so long. Their culture will be assimilated and then eradicated. So, as anthropologists, we've stood firmly with the Ata in supporting their right to not translate this text into languages that more people can read. So, we've got to really think about these ideas of ownership, of copyright, of trademark, of patents, right? Are any of these cultural symbols that are shared by large groups of people able to be owned?